Hey everyone, and welcome to the Good Arguments Podcast, Episode 2. I'm David Espute, and today is our first official discussion on a topic related to Christian doctrine. My guest today will be none other than Dr. William Lane Craig, world-famous philosopher, theologian, Christian apologist, author of many excellent books. He's debated all the world's greatest atheist debaters and defended the Christian worldview with excellence and class. However, I'm sorry to mislead you. Dr. Craig will not be joining us live on the pod today. Instead, I will be interacting with one of his Defenders class episodes on eschatology. Yes, our first ever topic will be end times. So for people who know me, you're probably not surprised, but seriously, end times is one of the, if not the most relevant topics today for many evangelical Christians because they've seen the precipitous decline of Christianity in the West and the insanity of the far left and far right. And they're like, Jesus must be returning soon. So it behooves me to prioritize these things. All right. Well, there are many Bible passages we could discuss when speaking about eschatology, but today we'll be focusing on the Olivet Discourse from Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. Of course, these are the synoptic gospels, and all three contain the same story from slightly different angles, but basically they're all the same. So we're going to read the passage from Mark's gospel. But first, I want to give you my perspective right off the bat. So here it is. All the events that Jesus predicts from Mark 13, 5 to 31 have already occurred. The wars, the famines, the earthquakes, the abomination of desolation, the false messiahs, the stars falling from heaven, the sun being darkened, the moon not giving its light, and yes, even the Son of Man coming on the clouds has already happened. I know, sounds crazy, right? Well, please don't turn this off. I promise that a great many conservative evangelical theologians and pastors also agree. But Craig does not, and that's why I'm going to interact with him today. So now let's read Mark 13, 1 to 31 in the ASV. And as we're going along, I would encourage you to set aside for a moment whatever lens you already have regarding this passage and try to read it like it's the first time. Pay close attention to the context and the questions that the disciples ask Jesus that prompts this lengthy response. All right, let's go. And as he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." And Jesus said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." And as he sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter and James and John and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished?" And Jesus began to say to them, "See that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name, saying, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray. And when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. These are but the beginning of the birth pains. But be on your guard, for they will deliver you over to councils, and you will be beaten in synagogues. And you will stand before governors and kings for my sake, to bear witness before them. And the gospel must first be proclaimed to all nations. And when they bring you to trial and deliver you over, do not be anxious beforehand what you are to say, but say whatever is given you in that hour. For it is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit. And brother will deliver brother over to death, and the father his child, and children will rise against parents and have them put to death. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to be, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down, nor enter his house to take anything out. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days, pray that it may not happen in winter. For in those days there will be such tribulation as has not been from the beginning of the creation that God created until now, and never will be. And if the Lord had not cut short the days, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, whom he chose, he shortened the days. And then if anyone says to you, "Look, here's the Christ," or "Look, there he is," do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform signs and wonders to lead astray, if possible, the elect. But be on guard. I have told you all things beforehand. But in those days after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. And then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. From the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see these things taking place, you know that he is near at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. So there we go. Preterists believe all these things took place between Jesus' resurrection and the destruction of Jerusalem, which occurred in 70 AD. So we turn now to Dr. William Lane Craig's class on this interpretation, and I need to say a few things right off the bat. Dr. Craig has been, without a doubt, the greatest influence on my theological journey to date. His approach, his heart, his clarity, his sound reasoning skills have all been incredibly inspiring to me. I will forever be indebted to his work and ministry. So I just wanted to make that abundantly clear. So we're going to do this response in maybe two parts, starting with his episode called The Doctrine of the Last Things, Part 5, the Preterist Interpretation. And one last point of qualification, I will be defending my own view today. I accept the label of partial preterist, even though I don't love labels to begin with, but for the sake of a good argument, I'll carry the label partial preterist. But as I say, I'm defending my own personal view here, not that of all people who call themselves partial preterists. I haven't read everything there is to read by others who hold the label, so please don't say, well, this guy says this. Fine. I'm not here to defend anyone else's view. I'm defending my own view. All right? Let's get into it.
Today, we want to turn to a second interpretation that also holds to multiple comings of Christ. This is the so-called preterist view.
Okay, so right off the bat, Craig characterizes the preterist view as one that holds to multiple comings of Christ, just like the rapture view, which is what he's referring to. But this needs an important qualification. Craig has neglected to mention that there are partial preterists and full preterists. And I'm sure he knows about this division, but I suspect he didn't mention it for simplicity's sake. But this was a mistake on his part because there is a major difference between partial preterism and full preterism. Partial preterists believe one bodily return of Christ, and we'll talk about the other non-bodily coming of Christ later. But full preterists don't actually believe in multiple comings of Christ at all. They believe in one spiritual coming of Christ and no bodily return. So you can see it is critical to separate these perspectives.
You may have heard from your English teacher when she taught you English grammar something about the past preterite tense. The tense of a sentence communicates that something is past when it's in the preterite tense. And this is what the preterist thinks with regard to the second coming of Christ.
All right, well, that's misleading. When Craig uses the phrase the second coming of Christ, most listeners will automatically think he's referring to the bodily return of Christ. But that's not what partial preterists think is already in the past. Partial preterists like myself and N.T. Wright, D.A. Carson, R.T. France, and R.C. Sproul believe that Jesus' bodily return to earth is still in the future. Of course, full preterists believe that Christ returned only in a spiritual sense, but these are not Orthodox Christians, and so Craig should know better than to accidentally imply that partial preterists believe Jesus has already returned bodily to earth.
Preterism says that the coming of Christ predicted by Jesus in the Olivet Discourse has already occurred.
All right, so another qualification is needed here. The Olivet Discourse, as I already mentioned, appears in Mark 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. But partial preterists recognize an important division in these chapters. So the parts that partial preterists believe are in the past are Matthew 24, 1 to 35, Mark 13, 1 to 31, and Luke 21, 1 to 33. Okay? Basically, the line that caps off the past stuff in the Olivet Discourse is, "This generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away." All right? So it's only those sections that partial preterists like me believe are in the past. We'll talk about the rest of those chapters another time.
According to the preterist, the coming of the Son of Man that Jesus predicted in the Olivet Discourse has, in fact, already occurred. It occurred in AD 70 with the destruction of Jerusalem. With that event, the Son of Man was enthroned in heaven.
Okay, so you see now Craig has qualified the type of coming that preterists acknowledge in the destruction of Jerusalem. He says that Christ was enthroned in heaven. Well, that's only partially true. While some, if not most, partial preterists have emphasized that particular element of the coming, for me, the primary way to describe this coming of Christ is as a coming in judgment. And we'll talk about this much more as we go along.
According to this interpretation, the events of the Olivet Discourse that Jesus predicted are not end-time events at all.
Okay, so again, this is misleading. I would absolutely describe the Great Tribulation that led up to the destruction of Jerusalem as an end-time event. The category of end times does not have to simply refer to events immediately before Christ's bodily return. I see the entire church age as the end times. So let's continue.
The descriptions of the Great Tribulation that Jesus refers to was, in fact, the horror of the Roman siege of Jerusalem, which, as we know from descriptions from the Jewish historian Josephus, really was indeed terrifying. It was a horrible siege as people began to cannibalize one another, even to eat their own children in order to stay alive under that terrible Roman siege.
Yes, so from here on, Craig does an amazing job of capturing the preterist view concerning the Olivet Discourse. He's incredibly fair and thorough, and you'd absolutely think he was defending this view himself. That's what I love so much about Craig, and it's how fair he is with opposing views. So let's jump forward.
In Mark chapter 13, verses 24 to 27, we have a description in apocalyptic imagery of the coming of the Son of Man. Jewish apocalyptic literature was literature about the advent of God or the judgment of God that would often be in highly symbolic imagery. So the description that we have in Mark 13, 24 to 27, is taken to be such an apocalyptic, symbolic account.
So Craig acknowledges that apocalyptic imagery is used in some areas of the Olivet Discourse and that this is symbolic language. I couldn't agree more.
There we read, "But in those days after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. And then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven." The preterist says that this is not a literal description of astronomical events. Rather, this is a description in apocalyptic imagery of the events of AD 70 and the presentation of the Son of Man before God.
All right, so unfortunately, Craig supplies a very basic, cursory explanation of the preterist understanding of these verses. And that's a shame because it's these verses that I think are the most problematic in the whole discourse. Most people struggle to see how these descriptions of crazy astronomical events could have passed already. It really sounds like the end of the world, right? Well, no. If we learn what the symbols mean, I think we'll see that these events happened already, just like all the other events leading up to the temple's destruction. So, to understand what's really going on in these verses, we must understand the various apocalyptic phrases that Jesus echoes from the Old Testament. The first phrase we're going to look at is, "The sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light." This phrase is echoed from Isaiah 13:10. So let's examine this verse in its context. Isaiah 13 is an oracle of Isaiah concerning judgment on Babylon. Verses 9 to 11 says, "Behold, the day of the Lord comes, cruel with wrath and fierce anger, to make the land a desolation and to destroy its sinners from it. For the stars of the heavens and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be dark at its rising, and the moon will not shed its light. I will punish the world for its evil and the wicked for their iniquity. I will put an end to the pomp of the arrogant and lay low the pompous pride of the ruthless." So here we know the immediate context is judgment on Babylon, but clearly there is a reference to all sinners and the wicked and the arrogant and the ruthless. And we know that even though a prophecy has an immediate application in its own context, it can be fulfilled or filled up in another future context. And that seems to be what Jesus is doing here. He's saying that in the same way that God condemned and judged Babylon, likewise, something similar will happen in the near future. What's interesting to notice is that Babylon is being judged for what they did to Judah, but it was God who used Babylon to judge Judah years before. This is clear from Jeremiah 5:8 to 11. And what this means is that two things can be true at once, right? God can judge Judah, his own people, through a foreign nation, and he can judge that foreign nation as well for doing it. This is so significant to realize because this is the exact thing that partial preterists believe is going on in the first few centuries of the church. You have God using the Roman armies to judge the Jewish system, the Old Covenant system, in the destruction of Jerusalem. And you also have condemnation and eventual judgment on the Roman Empire itself, even though they were the ones who carried out the judgment on Judah. So the phrase, "the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light," is a reference to judgment that God will execute on his enemies. The next apocalyptic phrase to examine is, "and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken." This phrase is borrowed from Isaiah 34:4, which says, "All the host of heaven shall rot away, and the skies roll up like a scroll. All their hosts shall fall as leaves fall from the vine, like leaves falling from the fig tree." So theologians agree that Isaiah 34 and 35 are a unit, with 34 focusing on judgment and 35 on redemption. So again, the phrase is a reference to God's coming judgment on the nations, and yet we're not to worry because redemption is coming. Clearly, this is an appropriate reference for Jesus to make because that is exactly what he accomplished: judgment on his enemies and redemption for his church. The next apocalyptic phrase to examine is the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. Well, this is a direct echo of Daniel 7:13-14, which reads, I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days, and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and a glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. So Dr. Craig says preterists interpret Jesus' reference to this passage as describing his enthronement in heaven. But obviously it's so much more than this. Once again, this apocalyptic image is found in a passage all about, you guessed it, judgment. In Daniel 7, Daniel has his vision of 4 beasts, and these 4 beasts are 4 kingdoms or empires. History tells us they were the Babylonians, the Medo-Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans successively. And so after Daniel has his vision, he wants to know the interpretation, particularly about the 4th beast, which ended up being the Roman Empire. And the angel gives him the details. Daniel says this in verse 21. As I looked, this horn made war with the saints and prevailed over them until the Ancient of Days came and judgment was given for the saints of the Most High. And the time came when the saints possessed the kingdom. So this horn, this ruler in the Roman Empire, makes war with the saints, according to Daniel's vision. Now, by far the best candidate for fulfilling this prophecy is Nero, who blamed the fire in Rome in 64 AD on the Christians and persecuted them for it. So this horn prevails in the sense that Jerusalem was put under siege for the next 7 years and the temple was destroyed. But in fact, the Christians prevailed because Jesus told them that this would happen in the Olivet Discourse. He told them all about the devastation that would take place and to flee into the mountains, Matthew 24:16. Meaning, don't stay and defend the temple because it will be thrown down. So just as Daniel saw, the saints were overcome in one way, but they survived and grew, and eventually, with the conversion of Constantine, became the dominant belief system in Rome before Rome was overtaken by the Goths. So if you're keeping track so far, every apocalyptic phrase Jesus used in Mark 13:24-27 so far is directly connected to judgment and falls right in line with the events of 70 AD. Now, what about verse 27, which says, and then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the 4 winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven? Well, all over the Old Testament, the phrase 4 winds is a reference to all directions or everywhere or all over the earth. Look at Zechariah 2:6. Here, Zechariah is encouraging his people, the Judahites, to return to Jerusalem from their captivity by the Babylonians. He writes, up, up, flee from the land of the north, declares the Lord, for I have spread you abroad as the 4 winds of the heavens, declares the Lord. So in this passage, God is calling his people back to himself after they'd been scattered in exile. But when Jesus uses this phrase, he says that after the cataclysmic judgment comes soon on his enemies, the Son of Man will send out his angels, not to bring his people back, but to gather his elect from the 4 winds, meaning all over. In other words, to build his church out of people from everywhere on earth. So as you can see, every apocalyptic phrase Jesus uses in Mark 13:24-27 falls perfectly in line with the judgment that was brought on both Jerusalem for rejecting and killing Christ, as well as the Roman Empire, who killed Christians and were complicit in killing Jesus. And all the while, these references also signal a coming redemption for Jesus' church and its growth across the earth. So I hope it's become clear that Craig has completely missed all of this by not properly looking into the significance of the particular apocalyptic phrases that Jesus used. He simply says, the preterist sees this as the presentation of the Son of Man before God, which is inadequate to say the very least. Now, I don't necessarily blame Craig for not giving this subject a fuller study, because he's always working on other projects like his work on the atonement or the historical Adam and Eve, and now his systematic philosophical theology. But I hope you can see that his analysis here has fallen far too short of his usual standards.
Compare, for example, Isaiah chapter 13 and verse 10. In these verses, as we see from verse 1, this is a prophecy concerning the destruction of Babylon. In verse 10, Isaiah says, "For the stars of the heavens and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be dark at its rising, and the moon will not shed its light." This is a very similar sort of imagery to what you have in Jesus' Olivet Discourse.
Yes, and so you see, he does understand where Jesus' words come from, but what he doesn't mention is that Isaiah's words are all about judgment. And I won't play the others, but Craig goes on to read similar apocalyptic passages from Ezekiel 2 and Acts 2, and his point is that these should not be taken literally, but symbolically. He says this:
It is apocalyptic imagery used to describe earth-shakingly significant events that God was bringing to pass.
Exactly. We agree. Just like the apocalyptic passages he mentions, the destruction of Jerusalem was indeed an earth-shakingly significant event that God brought to pass. But it would have been great if Craig recognized the significance of this. I must admit that I've often explained to believers that the Olivet Discourse is about events leading up to the fall of Jerusalem, and the average person who is open to the evidence can accept that quite easily. But what people really have a hard time accepting is that God is the one who destroyed Jerusalem and the old temple system. They seem to find this impossible, but why? As I already mentioned, when the Jews were taken into exile by Babylon, nobody denies that this was God judging his own people. I mean, that's what he promised to do if they turned away from him, which is exactly what happened. And so, why would we be surprised that he would do it again?
Moreover, if you turn back to Daniel chapter 7, where the coming of the Son of Man is predicted, preterists will point out that this is not a description of the coming of the Son of Man to earth. Rather, it is a description of the presentation of the Son of Man before God in the throne room of heaven.
Yes, partially correct, as I've already said. If Craig has a better explanation of what this passage means, he's welcome to offer it. But unfortunately, he doesn't. He simply critiques the preterist view in the second video, but fails to offer a solution here to the problem he highlights.
Now, I'm sure you will agree that this is certainly an interesting interpretation of the Olivet Discourse. But I think that what really motivates this view has not actually been mentioned so far. What really drives this view, I'm persuaded, is Mark 13:30, where Jesus says, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away before all these things take place." The preterist wants to solve the problem of the delay of the parousia by saying that all of these events predicted by Jesus did take place within the lifetime of his hearers. They did occur just as Jesus predicted they would within the lifetime of those who heard Jesus. These events literally occurred, and Jesus' prophecy was fulfilled.
Okay, this is a bit perplexing to me. Craig thinks preterists are motivated to believe that the contents of the Olivet Discourse are in the past because Jesus says these things will take place within the generation of his hearers. Yeah, of course we do, because that's what the text says. That's the perfect motivation for reading the text that way. We're not trying to solve the problem of the delay of the parousia. The word parousia does not appear anywhere in the Olivet Discourse. So, Craig, in attempting to show that preterists have a hidden agenda, actually pinpointed our real motive, which is to let the text stand on its own without projecting it into the distant future, because Jesus hasn't come back bodily yet. Remember, the question that the disciples ask, which prompts Jesus' long Olivet Discourse, is primarily about when the temple will be destroyed. And historians have confirmed that every tragic event predicted in the Olivet Discourse, such as earthquakes, famines, and the abomination of desolation, did occur leading up to the temple's destruction. You can read all about it in Josephus, or if you don't want to comb through all that, you can read about it in Holford's little book, The Destruction of Jerusalem. So preterists are only reading the text in a straightforward manner.
What might we say then by way of assessment of this interpretation? I think we have to say that initially this is an attractive view because it solves the very knotty problem of verse 30, where Jesus says all these things will take place before this generation passes away. We don't have to do any fancy explaining away of that verse because they all did literally happen.
Exactly.
So this makes the interpretation, I think, initially attractive. But I have to confess that after thinking about it, and with all the best will in the world, I'm just not persuaded that this is the correct interpretation of Jesus' teachings.
And my hope is to persuade you and others with these videos.
Like the rapture view, in the end, the preterist view also winds up having to posit an invisible coming of the Son of Man prior to his second, final coming to earth to establish his kingdom. So preterism, like the rapture view, winds up postulating multiple returns of Christ.
No, this is incorrect, or at least very misleading. Do you see how Craig has shifted from referring to multiple comings of Christ to multiple returns of Christ? This linguistic move tips his hand that he believes these terms are synonymous, which I don't believe they are. There is certainly some overlap between the two, which we'll get into in the next video, I hope. But for now, when I talk about these events, just so the listener is aware, I'll use the word coming for what Jesus did in 70 AD and return for his bodily return in the future. But as I say, I'll address this point more in the next video. Finally, at the risk of judging your motivations, Dr. Craig, it appears you want to believe in one second coming of Christ a priori. But where does this fundamental belief come from? It seems you hold this view already that there should only be one second coming of Christ, and you'd rather make all the scriptural data fit into this predetermined view rather than letting the scriptures make the decision for you. Let me give what I think is a really helpful analogy. In the Old Testament times, and especially during the Second Temple period, the Jews were expecting there to be only one coming of the Messiah, right? They were expecting a Davidic king to be born and rise up as the ultimate deliverer of the Jews, to conquer Israel's enemies and establish his throne forever, right? Everyone agrees that this was the expectation of all or most Jews. Yes, the Essenes may have believed in two messiahs, but they were a bit fringe. Anyway, the average Jew was not looking for a suffering servant who would sacrifice himself as the Passover lamb. They just weren't, even though they could have put things together. They didn't. So what we end up getting is two bodily comings of Christ, one in his state of humiliation, which has already taken place, and one in his state of glorification, which is yet in the future. Likewise, partial preterists like me have no issue with saying Christ has two comings which comprise the end times. The first being in his judgment to fulfill many of the day of the Lord prophecies and to seal the new covenant age, and the second to bring all things to their completion. So in the next video, we'll get into Craig's criticism of the preterist view in greater detail. But thanks for listening to the Good Arguments podcast, and we'll see you next time.